The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Hi, I'm Steve Saideman. I'm the director of the Canadian Defense and Security Network, as well as the Patterson Chair at Carleton University. Kingston has been my Canadian home away from home ever since I moved to Canada 20 plus years ago. First, because it was a thriving center of research on ethnic conflict when I was doing ethnic conflict. And since then, it's become such a thriving center of defense and security studies. And so KCIS was one of the founding components of the Canadian Defense and Security Network, where we were trying to claim to the Canadian government that we were a genuine partnership. This is a genuine partnership between the military, CIDP, the NATO Defense College, and used to be the U.S. Army War College. And so it's really been a model for the stuff that we've been organizing over the past 6 or 8 years or so. I've been asked to issue a challenge. And I've never issued a challenge before in this way, so I'm not exactly sure how one does this. But I think the topic itself, human security, is very challenging because it opens up the realm of issues to be quite varied, because there's all kinds of things that affect people across the planet. And as I was thinking about this, I looked up Roland Parris's record, because he wrote one of the most definitive pieces about this. And that helped me set in time when this debate was really thriving in its original period of time, where in the idea of human security had been developing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but it really peaked in the 1990s, where we had lots of conversations about this. There seemed to be great potential for it, because the end of the Cold War opened up the United Nations for actually having things go through the UN Security Council without being blocked by the Cold War. So the United Nations got involved in all kinds of endeavors, including lots of peacekeeping. We had a lot of scholars writing about human security. We had Canada helping to promote a conversation about responsibility to protect. We have a variety of treaties to ban landmines and cluster bombs. There's a lot of efforts made in the late 1990s. And they kind of faded. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq kind of pushed this to the side. And so now this is coming back. And I think it's striking that this conference is looking at this issue. But this is a very, very challenging time. So we now have the non-traditional threats that we're thinking about in the 1990s. We were thinking, well, climate change is going to happen someday. We need to try to avert it. And people looked at Al Gore as being sort of strange for talking about this a lot. But climate change is here now, and it is causing devastating impacts to humans and everybody and everything else on the planet. And so we have that reality. We have multiple wars in the Middle East, in Ukraine. We have a potential war on the horizon with China and Taiwan. Thinking about the Ukraine war, it not only has had an impact on the people of Ukraine, but it greatly affected food security around the world, and food security is obviously a key component of human security. So the challenge I'm offering for you today is, can we take these older ideas and figure out how to apply them anew in a world where populism is on the march? When I think about human security, I think about empathy. When I think about populism, I think about resentment. And so there's a critical clash right now between the forces that are animating elections in a variety of countries and human security, which could be seen as the cure, or it can be seen as the coyote on the road that gets run over by the cars and trucks of populism. So this is the central challenge of our time. And we have countries around the world that are engaging in aggressive behavior, whether it's India killing Canadian citizens in Canada and threatening to kill American citizens in the United States. We have China again threatening to attack Taiwan. And now we have an American government that will be not in power yet. It seems like it's already happened, but it hasn't. We can breathe for a couple months. But when the Trump administration comes forth, it is going to be a government animated by resentment and cruelty. And it's going to visit that cruelty not only on Americans, but on the rest of the world. And so what can be done in human security with a paralyzed United Nations and a hostile United States. That's my challenge for you guys to think about over the next 2 days. I'm going to be leaving early in the morning, not because I'm fearful of the challenge I've offered to you, but I fear my students, and I have a class this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you. And if I could get Juliana and Roland Haras up for the keynote. Please.
Good morning. Yes. Hi. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. What a pleasure to be back in Kingston. Also my first home away from home once upon a time. And to see so many familiar faces and new ones as well. Thank you, Dr. Colombo and Dr. Saideman, for your thoughtful remarks. I think they're important as we navigate an ever more combustible world, one where civilians are increasingly the target, and where our rights to the freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom to live in dignity is systematically violated as a way of war. Now, at last year's conference, we benefited from a fantastic panel on human security, a topic that lights a fire in the heart of this child of the axe-worthy era. Our speakers highlighted the need for a human security framework to anchor state security, which in turn is fundamental to human security. And they underscored just how central advancing human security is to strengthening public trust in institutions and to the legitimacy of the use of force. Now, we're fortunate today to have an influential voice on this subject, as well as many others, as our opening keynote speaker, Roland Paris. So, full professor and director at University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, fellow at Chatham House, founding director of the university's Center for International Policy Studies. Dr. Paris has served on a 10-member expert group that advised the Secretary General of NATO. And he's received several awards for his research on international security, 4 awards for teaching, and 2 awards for public service. Now, indeed, he has taken several academic leaves to serve in government, including at Global Affairs Canada, the Privy Council Office, and as the senior advisor on global affairs and defense to none other than the Prime Minister. He's the quintessential public intellectual, a name familiar to many across Canada and internationally. He engages not only through the written word formally, but frequently provides commentary, interviews, participates in panel discussions, and his recent reflections have ranged on everything from the need to prepare for war through to the fate of liberal democracy south of the border. Now, outside of work, his passions include wilderness canoeing, and he's a member of the Regional Volunteer Search and Rescue Team. Speaking of what's most dear to him, I see Simon in the room. Simon is a 4th-year engineering student here at Queen's. Simon is Roland's son, so welcome to the group and to the conference. Now, Dr. Paris's research interests, they include international norms, multilateralism, sovereignty, geopolitical competition. By default, this expertise cuts across threat actors and strategic theaters. So he's shared that he would be more than happy to receive questions that touch on any subject really that piques your interest. Anything from Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which has a painfully clear nexus with human security, through to China-Taiwan, through to US-Canada relations. So lean in, and please, when the time comes for Q&A, don't be shy. So Roland, welcome to KCIS, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that incredibly generous, really too generous introduction. I was sitting there listening. I want to meet this person who is this. Juliana, it's really kind of you. I'm really happy to have my son here in the room. It's great to see old friends, meet people, new people. So thank you very much for the introduction. And I should say, planning on participating in this entire event, but family emergency unfortunately requires that we return to Ottawa right after this session. So I'm happy at least to be able to join you this morning and to talk about human security. And Steve Saideman, we didn't talk about what our respective remarks would be in any detail, but not surprisingly, he picks up some themes that I would actually like to develop in these remarks. As we all know, human security as a topic, it covers many issues, but fundamentally, it's about improving the safety and the security and well-being of individuals and groups, in contrast to more conventional notions of national security that focus more on the defense of sovereign states and societies as a whole. But whether we're talking about human or national security, there's no denying that we are living through some very difficult, if not dark days. And it's easy, I think, to get discouraged by the broadly negative trends for many aspects of what many would think of as a human security agenda. If you are, for example, concerned about the weakening of respect for the laws of war, you're not alone. Who couldn't be distressed by the callous disregard for civilian lives in Gaza, the Ukraine, Sudan, among other places? And these aren't just isolated instances. In just 1 year, from 2022 to 23, the total number of civilian casualties in armed conflicts rose by 72%. And how appalling is it in this context that the president-elect of the United States has nominated a man for U.S. Secretary of Defense who came to Trump's attention primarily when he was lobbying Trump during his first term to exonerate a U.S. Navy SEAL who had been accused of war crimes. Meanwhile, climate change impacts on the lives of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people around the world have been worsening. Food security, as Steve said, has been weakening as a result of supply chain disruptions and war. And these and other challenges to human security have been multiplying, while the instruments that we created to manage complex collective problems, well, those instruments, unfortunately, have also been weakening. So given these developments, I think it's entirely normal to look out at the world and to wonder if progress in these areas, whether we call it human security or not, whether there's any hope or whether these initiatives are the roadrunner, the coyote that's at risk of being run over. Well, I'm sure that many of you have been part of discussions that have considered some bleak scenarios in the future, and I know that there'll be some pretty sober discussions here at this conference. So I'd actually like to start off for you by suggesting that there is hope. And I'm going to do that first by placing the present moment in a larger historical context, then by talking about some of the areas in which progress is still taking place, and finally by explaining why I think a renewed effort to advance the goals of human security is more relevant now than ever. So let me start with a bit of historical context. When we say that current trends are bad, we need to be conscious of the standard of comparison that we're using. In relative terms, most measures of human security today are far more positive than they've been, not just in most of human history, but in most of our lifetimes. People are living longer with less disease and less poverty and more education than they were in the 1990s when Canada first championed this idea of human security. To give you just one statistic, an estimated 22 million people have not died of AIDS in the past 3 decades due to life-saving medications. Or consider something as basic as drinking water. The proportion of the global population using safely managed drinking water increased from 69% to 73% in the last few years, just between 2015 and 2022. Taking a historical perspective is useful even in areas where there's been backsliding, like the one I mentioned, international humanitarian law. We rightly wonder, for example, about the future of the International Criminal Court, which was created to prosecute crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. But as we worry about the prospects for the court and what it means for the laws of war, let's not forget that before 2002, such worries would have been misplaced for the simple reason that the ICC didn't exist yet. There wasn't a court to worry about. It was created in that year. My point here is that many of the worrying trends that we're talking about in this conference are disturbing, and they are disturbing, relative to an extraordinary period of progress that most of us have lived through, and namely during the quarter century or so after the Cold War. So yes, we should be concerned about current trends. I am concerned about current trends. I don't think Canada is necessarily prepared for the world that is emerging quickly. But pessimism, or worse, hopelessness, is neither a warranted response given this historical context that I'm offering, nor is it a productive response to the headwinds that the elements of human security now face. If you want to talk about hopelessness, imagine you were one of the people working to bring an end to human slavery in the 19th century. For virtually all of human history, slavery was considered perfectly normal. So normal, in fact, that few people, even just a couple hundred years ago, could imagine this institution ever coming to an end. It was deeply, deeply entrenched, not just in people's thinking, but in the economic systems of the day. More than 700,000 African slaves were transported to the New World during the decade of the 1780s, a trade in human lives that was dominated by Britain. And it was a trade that generated enormous profits, both directly and indirectly, including Britain's lucrative sugar industry, for example, in the West Indies. Yet a group of people, of activists, in this case affiliated with the Quakers and other churches in England, and allied with secular figures who saw slavery as an affront to human rights, together managed to convince first England, then other European powers, and the United States, and finally most jurisdictions of the world, to outlaw slavery. If you want to feel hopelessness, put yourself in their shoes. Or put yourself in the shoes of Elizabeth Stanton and Lucretia Mott, two American women who traveled to England to attend the World Anti-Slavery Conference, and who were inspired by what the movement had already accomplished in the mid-19th century. But they were also outraged that as women, they weren't allowed to be seated at the conference. So when they returned to the United States, they were instrumental in organizing a historic conference for women's rights held in 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York, where Stanton first suggested a resolution calling for women's suffrage. It's hard to imagine today just how extraordinary that idea was. Voting was considered the quintessential male domain of activity, such that even Stanton's most resolute supporters were afraid that putting forward this resolution might make the entire women's rights movement, quote, look ridiculous and compromise their other goals and objectives. In the end, although the resolution calling for women's suffrage was passed by the participants at that Seneca Falls meeting, it was only by a small margin. The idea of women voting was that far outside of what most people considered even possible. So let's return to the present. Yes, many elements of what we might call the human security agenda are facing stiff headwinds. But the goals themselves, the idea that individuals, no matter where they live, deserve security and health, well, these goals are already widely accepted as legitimate and worthy goals, the task is much less enormous than it was for those who worked to end slavery or give women the right to vote. So perhaps at this point you might be thinking, well, you're talking about some pretty old history here. That was a long time ago. I'm not sure how relevant these comparisons are to the present day, but I think that they do offer some important and enduring lessons. The first is about perseverance. These advocates were playing a long game. It took decades to accomplish their goals finally, despite great resistance and setbacks, but they ultimately succeeded. And I think to persevere in this way, they had to believe that it was possible to tap into a broad public sense of justice and fairness and to redirect those sentiments towards action. I think that that's also true in the area of human security, that most people in most places not only want a good life for themselves and their families, but can empathize with other people, including the idea that no one should have to live with fear or suffering. That's the idea of human security, and I think it remains a powerful one that is available to be activated. Secondly, the anti-slavery and women's suffrage campaigns succeeded because they focused on very specific goals. And here I think that this, whatever we want to call it, the human security enterprise, can also take instruction. We all know that human security is a very broad category, which is made up of even more complicated interconnections between different issues. Armed conflicts, economic distress, rights violations, environmental stresses, disease, lack of education, and the list goes on. Sorting out these interconnections and clarifying them is a very worthy academic objective. But in the end, for human security to make advances, it needs to be disaggregated into individual elements. Otherwise, calling for human security risks losing its effectiveness precisely because the call encompasses so many different things. And a perfect example of this is the UN Secretary General's report on human security issued in January of this year. So it was the first report that he issued on this topic since 2013. And he noted in the report that the world today is markedly different than it was a decade ago. That's an understatement. It was, it was an unusual report in the sense that it didn't say anything surprising. Here's a quote. He said, "Multi-layered crises, whether stemming from the pandemic disasters or conflict, are no longer isolated events confined to certain countries or regions. Tragedies taking place a continent away are interacting in new ways, reaching unprecedented scale and testing people on every front." Absolutely true. But I encourage you to take a look at the document itself and ask yourself whether it leaves you inspired in any way to do something about these problems. And it doesn't, or at least it didn't for me, because thinking about the enormity and complexity of all of the challenges facing the world is, in my view, a recipe for paralysis, not focused action. Progress comes from determined efforts to address specific problems. And while human security is a useful label for many of these problems, it's too ill-defined, too abstract to be an effective focal point for international action and change. There's one final lesson, I think, that comes from the anti-slavery and women's suffrage movements. They were driven, at least initially, by private citizens and civil society organizations that eventually succeeded in recruiting states to their cause, not the other way around. And they were able to do so partly because they succeeded in convincing other people and other private organizations that these issues mattered. They tapped into the reservoir of sentiment that I mentioned a moment ago, what I believe is a latent willingness among most people in most places to respond positively to calls for justice and fairness. Conditions involving states and non-governmental actors, coalitions involving states and non-governmental actors can be very powerful, as Canada has demonstrated many times. We're not a great power, but we do have the capacity to play this role effectively, and there's no reason it can't continue. The kind of mobilization of common interests was the heart of the human security agenda in the 1990s. And although the label was later dropped, successive Canadian governments have continued with this playbook, whether was Stephen Harper's initiative on maternal, child, and newborn health, or the current government's efforts to ban international trade in goods produced by forced labor. Now, some might say maybe these days are gone. Maybe the coyote has already been run over, that Canada can no longer afford to advocate for such goals in a nastier and more competitive world, a world in which we face the prospects of tariffs imposed by our largest trading partner. But my answer to that is to pose another question. Do we really have to choose to do one thing or another? Surely we can walk and chew gum at the same time. When Brian Mulroney invested political capital in the campaign to end South African apartheid, I don't remember people saying that that was a distraction from negotiating free trade with the United States. And nor do I think that this Canadian approach is necessarily going to change if there's a change of government in this country. A new government's emphasis might change. The issues that it pursues will likely be different, somewhat different, but I expect that the broad goal of improving human security will continue. So the bottom line is this: we are living through a time of mounting uncertainty in international affairs. That goes without saying. The threat of large-scale war is growing faster than I think many Canadians recognize. And the wars that are taking place are distressingly brutal for civilian populations. The instruments of accountability are weakening, and the problem of impunity is growing. And meanwhile, the combined effects of climate change, technological disruption, economic dislocation, mounting geopolitical competition, and emboldened autocrats who have limited interests in the welfare of populations outside their borders or even inside their borders, well, these things are all eroding some of the human security gains of recent decades. But faced with these challenges, the answer is not to despair about the state of the world. Doing so just serves no purpose. Rather, we need to remember that the human security campaign is just one part of a centuries-long effort to make the lives of people safer, better, and more free. And that this campaign has achieved enormous success because people were willing to imagine a future where these goals could be achieved, and then to apply themselves individually and collectively to working towards bringing it about. And we're all actors in this story too, whether we study some dimension of human security or work within a government or international organization or the military, or in a voluntary organization, or just as individuals. What I'm suggesting is that we can simultaneously be realistic about the daunting challenges facing the world and facing Canada, while also justifiably hopeful that our efforts can bear fruit, because the future is not written in stone. Thank you.